look back at this and I look back at the video that I did on the same topic, I think to myself, you know what? I was 100% correct that this guy here was an absolute fruitcake and still is. However, I do have to make a slight adjustment on one other person, which, by the way, we'll be talking about in this video here. Now, guys, this video right here, for the most part, is a reaction to the segment on Piers Morgan where he had a conversation with Andrew Roberts about the guy who claims to be a historian, even though he's got no notable works out there to prove nothing scholarly about Mr. Cooper. Which, of course, I'm not a historian myself, but still at the same time, as I said in the previous video, a lot of this right here is basic common sense that you learn in middle school. You even learn some of it in elementary school. And, of course, you can learn on basic, good old-fashioned documentaries. And if you actually read some books, you'll see that what Mr. Cooper was saying just made him look like an absolute fruitcake. However, the person that I'm most upset about with this is actually Tucker Carlson, a journalist that I actually, quite frankly, admire. If that right there kind of gives up the game, then okay. But when you're basically saying that this guy right here has a better understanding of history than any other historian, then, well, you lose a lot of credibility in my mind. Now, in no way, shape, or form am I disavowing my like or whatnot for Tucker. It's mostly just something I disagree with him on. And, of course, I also disagree with Tucker on a few other things. One of those things I disagree with him on is the bombing of Japan. But like I said, starting this video out with a nice little minute-long monologue, which, by the way, was something I did not plan to do, because you guys know me, I do things off script. I think it's a very, very good segue into seeing exactly the folly of what was actually said in Tucker Carlson's interview with Daryl Cooper. Now, before we get started, this right here is like part one of part two. There's going to be another part out tomorrow where I respond more to Seth Dillon and Dave Smith, because they all said some things to say as well. And, of course, Dave Smith is one of those guys who's endorsed Mr. Cooper, but we're going to be talking about that over the course of this video, so let's go ahead and dive in.
Can't be true. That isn't true. Well, I know that's not true, but the overarching theme that somehow Churchill was a bigger villain than Hitler was so preposterous to me.
And Stalin
Was so utterly preposterous that at that point I went, I can't believe anything this guy's telling me.
Yes, the shocking thing for me was that Tucker Carlson was taking him seriously at all. A lot of this is just reheated old David Irving stuff from 20 years ago. There were 8 or 9 major accusations that he made against Winston Churchill, none of which were true.
Now, you guys obviously saw about 30 seconds there, Pierce and Andrew, and I want to go ahead and tell you guys, if you don't know who Andrew Roberts is the guy who wrote the book Napoleon, A Life. He is a historian. He also did a very good lecture on World War II on why it was that Hitler actually lost. We oftentimes love to say it was actually Hitler who lost that said war. A lot of times we do that not because we're coming at it from a pro-German angle. We're really coming at it more from a this guy was an absolute idiot angle is what we're coming from, because a lot of the things that were done during World War II, I would say from about 1941 on to the end, it defies logic. It's the same exact thing that I would be saying if we talked about the generals who fought in the American Civil War, the generals who led the armies in the American Civil War. We would talk about the mistakes that Grant made, the mistakes that Lee made, the mistakes that other generals had made throughout that entire ordeal. So we're trying to come at this as from an unbiased perspective as possible. However, there is one thing that I do want to go ahead and get out of the way, and if anybody gets upset with me saying this, I really truly don't care. I don't find Joseph Stalin to be a hero at all. I think if you actually go through and look at the death counts and look at what was actually done between each actual honest-to-God ideology in each actual nation, I'm talking about Hitler's Germany, Stalin's Soviet Union, eventually Mao's China, you will find out that in there, Joseph Stalin was just as bad, if not worse in some cases. Yes, I understand that right there may get me in trouble, but I advise you guys to read what was going on in Russia from 1917, the Russian Revolution, all the way to World War II itself, and you'll probably come away with a different opinion of Stalin. You'll basically just say that, yeah, maybe George S. Patton was correct. Now that we got that out of the way, now let us go ahead and dive into this. Before we get back to the conversation, I want to go ahead and say this right now. I'm not saying this as some guy who's a Churchill fan. However, I got to be honest with you. There were a lot of decisions that were made and a lot of warnings that Winston Churchill gave to the United States that we, for some odd reason, just completely, totally to gaff off. Now, I talked about Stalin for a second, gave you guys some quick thoughts. Let me go ahead and kind of further enhance the thoughts and, or at least further explain why I feel the way I do about Joseph Stalin. I also feel the exact same way about FDR, too. Bear with me for a second. It's going to take a minute to explain. When I say that George S. Patton was correct, I'm talking about the take where George S. Patton said we need to kick their behinds back into Russia where they belong. You see, the Potsdam Conference, there was this thing called the naughty document, or it was what Winston Churchill called a naughty document, which was basically FDR telling Joseph Stalin, you know what, we're just going to go ahead and let you have pretty much all of Eastern Europe, and of course, communism is just as bad, if not worse, than fascism, which of course they all come from the same bird, Karl Marx, because Giovanni Gentili, the man who actually came up with fascism, he was also a Marxist as well. I'll link this video from Eric D. July in the description box, and possibly, if I can, the one from Razor Fist as well. I advise you guys watch this if you want some further information. Yes, Nazis were socialists. It even says so in the name, National Socialists. But the point is this right here. Winston Churchill was trying to warn us that maybe you should not let the Russians have so much. Maybe you should not allow them to have everything east of Berlin, because one whole half of Europe is going to be living under the communist boot, which is just as bad, if not worse, than the boot of fascism. The reason why I chose to lead with that is because there are some people who think that Churchill's actually the villain in that situation, when in reality, Churchill's actually the one who was warning FDR. And then, of course, after FDR died in April of 1945, Harry Truman took over and basically stuck to the agreement. Now, Truman gets points in some people's minds because he decided to drop the bombs on Japan. Something that, by the way, I disagree with Tucker Carlson on. I was very, very much in favor of dropping the bomb on Japan. I think I did a video on that before. I'll probably do another video on it at a later date because, as you guys know, I do plan on creating a history channel, or a channel to answer some questions about basic history. But let's get back to the interview.
The key ones, because I think it'd be useful to viewers who didn't watch it to play a little clip and get your response to what was claimed. So the first one, Cooper argued that, as I said, that Churchill could be seen as the chief villain of World War II, and he was responsible for it becoming more than just an invasion of Poland. Let's take a look.
How would you assess Winston Churchill?
I thought Churchill was the chief villain of the Second World War. Now, he didn't kill the most people. He didn't commit the most atrocities. But I believe, and I think when you really get into it and tell the story right and don't leave anything out, you see that he was primarily responsible for that war becoming what it did, becoming something other than an invasion of Poland.
You're going to hear me say this again, and I'm going to say this before I let the next minute and 8 seconds of Andrew's response come. If you want to blame somebody for the escalation during World War II, maybe you should blame Neville Chamberlain. You see, when Hitler went into the Sudetenland, Neville Chamberlain thought that appeasement would be a good idea. Now, it's possible that maybe Neville Chamberlain thought to himself, because he was actually the prime minister at the time, not Churchill, it's possible that maybe Chamberlain was trying to buy the British some time. Of course, World War I, and I've heard this argument right here on several occasions about World War I, that maybe if we'd have handled the Treaty of Versailles properly, and maybe if that right there had been done correctly, World War II might not have occurred. I tend to agree with that, but only to a certain extent. Something tells me that the Second World War was coming regardless. It's just the times itself, competition, stuff like that could eventually breed war, or hyper competition in certain areas, hyper paranoia, stuff like that there. I'll probably explain that in another video, because I want, for the most part, stay on topic here. I understand I'm getting off topic. I don't mean to, but just bear with me. I think that at some point in time, the Second World War probably would have occurred. It may not have occurred under the vein of Germany at that time, but given the fact that the Soviet Union throughout the 20s, or really the 30s, and Stalin trying to basically become a global power, it's possible that Europe could have faced a fight from Stalin. Now, some people will say that that's stupid because Stalin did not believe in spreading communism throughout all of Europe or throughout the rest of the world. And my response to that would be, you might want to go back and look at history, and you might want to ask yourself, when the hell has a communist ever been honest? But let's let Andrew respond.
Your response.
Well, he wasn't even prime minister until May 1940. The invasion of Poland took place in September 1940. And when Hitler invaded the Low Countries and unleashed blitzkrieg in the West, Churchill wasn't even prime minister until later that same day. So he can't be blamed for that. He certainly can't be blamed for Hitler's decision to attack in the West, because that was taken months beforehand with Hitler's major generals. And so that falls at the first hurdle. As far
So
as
the
I'm
basic
concerned.
premise for his claim that Churchill was somehow more villainous is
It's
undone
ludicrous.
by reality.
It's ludicrous, undone actually by chronology, because of course Hitler was listening to his generals and giving orders to his generals. And Winston Churchill at the time was First Lord of the Admiralty. He was in charge of the Royal Navy and had nothing to do with these decisions.
Is there any suggestion, backed by anything that has remote credibility, that Hitler only intended originally to invade Poland and then the escalation was created by provocation?
None whatsoever. No, there was no provocation. There was the phone.
Yeah, there was an American Heroes channel. Actually, no, I take it back. It was a History Channel documentary called Commanders at War, where they actually focused in on Churchill. And it is said that Churchill had conversations with Neville Chamberlain after this and basically criticized him for showing any form of appeasement. Now, I don't want to go too much into the weeds here because, like I said before, I'm not really a historian. I'm more just a common sense guy, a guy who could just debunk half the crazy stuff that Darrell Cooper said with just good old-fashioned common sense. But the thing is this right here. When World War II started, or after Adolf Hitler invaded Poland, he already had a desire to invade France. The biggest reason why he had a desire to invade France was because of the humiliation that was World War I for Germany. Okay, you want proof of that? Look at what he did at the very end of the fight with France. So the initial fight with France, look at what he did. Goes straight to the Eiffel Tower, and then he eventually wants a treaty signed in the same boxcar that the Treaty of Versailles was agreed upon. There was a personal vendetta and a personal grudge with France. I think that there is pretty obvious based upon the actions that he did right there at the very end of the war. Also, something else, too, it wasn't that different from the von Schlieffen plan, which may get brought up, of course, this video, because once again, I'm for the most part reacting. By the way, that right there does lead me to a segue at the very end of the video that I'll be throwing out there to kind of break down this whole reactionary thing. But still, though, at the same time, though, a lot of people love to say that, well, Hitler just wanted the war contained to Poland. This isn't World War I. World War I, you could argue that Germany wanted the war maintained to Austro-Hungary and Serbia. You could argue that, but this right here is not the same fight. Hitler wanted a good portion of Europe, and he definitely wanted Eastern Europe, and he definitely had a deep down hatred and resentment for people of Slavic origin. But let's continue.
War in which nothing happened in that 9-month period. And what he always wanted to do was to knock the Western countries out of the war so as to be able to concentrate entirely on the thing that he had always wanted to do throughout his career, which was to win Lebensraum in the East by invading Russia.
Let's play a second clip. This is where Cooper argues that Hitler became obsessed with persuading Britain not to continue the war after Dunkirk.
The British have, escaped at Dunkirk. There's no British force left on the continent. There's no opposing force left on the continent. In other words, the war is over and the Germans won. And throughout that summer, Adolf Hitler is firing off radio broadcasts, giving speeches, literally sending planes over to drop leaflets over London and other British cities, trying to get the message to these people that Germany does not want to fight you. Like, we don't want to fight you. Offering peace proposals that, it said, you keep all your overseas colonies. We don't want any of that. We want Britain to be strong. The world needs Britain to be strong. Churchill wanted a war. He wanted to fight Germany.
Churchill went out of his way to try and avoid the Second World War. He warned against Germany. He warned that you had to be strong against Adolf Hitler. But the idea that he was some warmonger is something that Goebbels said, and David Irving, and very few other serious people, apart from this Mr. Cooper figure.
There's the famous Neville Chamberlain peace in our time moment, of course, before it all erupts. Is that indicative that Hitler genuinely wanted any kind of peace? Or was
No. He even at the time, he laughed behind Chamberlain's back and sneered at him and ridiculed him.
Let's play the third clip.
I'll hit the Battle of Britain in the pamphlets after the next clip, but I want to go ahead and clamp down on something first before we get there. Bear with me. We'll get to the Battle of Britain soon. Okay, now, guys, I let that one there run just a little bit longer than normal, but I want to go ahead and say this, and I think that Andrew's opinion may be a little bit different than mine, but at the same time, though, we could always have a bit of a back and forth. By the way, I don't agree with everything that Andrew is saying, but I definitely find him to be a lot more credible than Mr. Cooper. The thing that you got to understand about Hitler's forage into the East is that Stalin obviously believed this was coming. It's part of the reason why is that Stalin also jumped into Poland as well while Hitler was going into Poland. But part of the reason why Stalin did that, many people have stated, is because Stalin believed that war at some point in time was going to happen, so therefore he was buying himself some time. However, this very also shows you how stupid Stalin was when you actually look at the reasons for why he was trying to buy himself some time. All you got to do is just Google the Great Purge. Look at how many of his own that he killed, and then also go turn right back around after that and look at what Stalin would do later on that year. And of course, going into 1940, he would launch the Winter War into Finland, which would cost the Russians right around 500,000 of their own men. Stalin was not a bright light either, okay? And I understand that I'm talking about Stalin when we should be talking about Churchill, but the fact of the matter is that if you're going to try to sit here and say that Churchill is the chief villain of this war and what the hell is going on, then chances are you're probably a nut. And I'm not saying that to be insulting to Mr. Cooper. I'm being honest with him. Seek help, man. You got some serious problems. To believe that Churchill is the villain of the war, especially given the fact that he was not even prime minister when Hitler invaded Poland, or when Hitler, previous to that, actually went to the Sudetenland, I think is absolutely ludicrous. But then again, there's also another accusation that was thrown at Mr. Churchill, who financed him, stuff like that there, which you normally hear from these nutbags. That right there is basically what I'm going to say on that topic there. But of course, the fact of the matter is this here. Hitler going into the East was always a goal of his because he hated the frickin' Slavs, all right? He always hated them. By the way, in the previous video that I did on this, we talked a little bit about how it was that the Germans were supposedly not ready for the prisoners or POWs. Okay, well, if you're not ready for POWs, if you're not ready for prisoners, then maybe you probably should not launch a war into the East. But of course, Hitler was going to do that anyway, so therefore, obviously, civilians were probably going to die. But then again, I also stated in the previous video that maybe if Hitler had gone as like a liberator because the Soviet Union was oppressive too, then maybe it's possible you might have had some people helping you out. Just simply saying. I mean, there were Ukrainians who did fight on the side of the Nazis. I'm just simply saying. But let's continue.
To continue the war after Hitler tried to sue for peace, Cooper says that Churchill was committing rank terrorism because he didn't have the means to reinvade Europe.
He was literally, by 1940, sending firebomb fleets, sending bomber fleets to go firebomb the Black Forest. Just rank terrorism, starting to, what eventually became just the carpet bombing, the saturation bombing of civilian neighborhoods, to kill, is the purpose of which was to kill as many civilians as possible.
Your response to that, Andrew?
Again, complete rubbish.
There is a lot wrong with this statement. I mean, a lot wrong with this statement. Andrew, you're going to hear him explain here in a second that the British actually already had the strongest navy, and that's actually true. Hitler's navy, for the most part, was mostly U-boats, submarines. They did have the here and there ship, but for the most part it was U-boats. Something else, too, that needs to be explained is the capabilities of the British during the war. They still had a very, very strong air force, and it's actually the thing that, quite frankly, kept them alive during the Battle of Britain. Also, something else, too, about those pamphlets. And there is one thing that Daryl Cooper does get correct. Hitler did not want to actually conquer England. He actually wanted to keep England as a trading partner. He actually wanted England to be strong. He's actually not lying about it. He didn't want to be stronger than Germany, but he did want them to be stronger to trade with. But, of course, people also forget that right after Pearl Harbor, Hitler decided to declare war on the United States, which, by the way, is going to come up a little bit later on this video because it also shows you how stupid Adolf Hitler was. But let me play this part right here for you and then come back on the other end and reclamp down on what Andrew is saying in his response to this lunacy that comes from Mr. Cooper.
We did have the means to fight back. We had the greatest navy in the world. We were starting to blockade Germany. We were fighting on the North African littoral at that stage as well. The idea that the war should just end because Hitler has decided that he's won. What he hasn't done is disgorged Poland, and that was the reason we went to war in the first place. So there is absolutely no evidence to back up these accusations.
Isn't it right that Britain had given Poland effective guarantees that if they were attacked, we would defend them?
Yes, on the 1st of April 1939, we gave a guarantee to Poland. And if we hadn't stuck up for that and actually seen that through, it would have been a complete humiliation and very dishonourable, actually, on the part of Britain.
Exactly, but there's also one more thing, too, that needs to be said before I go any further, because, once again, Mr. Cooper acts like the British didn't have any actual capability for war, and that is the reason why they're burning down forests and killing civilians and crap, when this idiot obviously does not seem to understand that, Adolf Hitler was also killing civilians in Poland. He was killing civilians pretty much through the entire East. Now, I'm not trying to say this to justify what Britain was doing. However, it was much, much more prominent on the German end. Also, something else, too, that needs to be said. When we talk about overall military capabilities, Britain obviously had some capabilities. I mean, they had radar ahead of what the Germans had, which also aided in the defense of Britain, the Battle of Britain itself, And to go on top of this, when the war really and truly began to actually intensify in 1940, 1941, the British, they were able to send people to Greece to try to provide some form of distraction to help the Greeks out against the Italians. They also, at the same time, were also able to fight in North Africa. I mean, the Battle of El Alamein would give General Bernard Montgomery hero status for that there because he was able to defeat Rommel, even though some people will argue that he didn't. But still, at the same time, though, it's not like England was just fighting dirty or anything. At the time, England was kind of the only country fighting the Germans before the U.S. stepped in. Eventually, Russia in June 1941, which Stalin kept on claiming that he never saw it coming, which I actually believe because Stalin, quite frankly, was not the genius people make him out to be. He was an absolute idiot. I mean, the same guy who killed basically 1/3 of his own military in the early 1930s because he wanted to purge them, and then he decided to launch a fruitless war against the Finns in late 1939, early 1940, and kill a good portion of his army. Anytime somebody says Stalin's a hero, I just bust out laughing at him. Anytime somebody says that Russia won World War II, I bust out laughing at them because they forget the Lend-Lease agreement. They forget exactly how it was that the U.S., when we decided to hit Italy, the Battle of Kursk was going on, and Hitler was forced to pull his best tanks out of action at that point in time. A lot of reasons why it is that Russia did not win World War II. But let me add one more thing to that, too. Right after Dunkirk, the British were basically by themselves. They were pretty much on their own. It was like that from a good portion of 1940 going into 1941. They were pretty much on their own. They were the only people even standing up to Hitler. I just figured I'd point that out before we get back to the interview.
Media operations, propaganda operations, everything that they were running in the United States to eventually drag us into that war. And that was his whole plan. His whole plan was we don't have a way to fight this war ourselves. This war is over. We need either the Soviet Union or the United States to do it for us. And that was the plan, and kept the war going long enough for that plan to come to fruition. And to me, it's a craven, ugly way to fight a war.
It does seem quite bizarre that he would say that the way we perpetrated the defense against the Nazis was an ugly, craven way to fight a war, given that Hitler was literally executing a Holocaust of millions and millions of people.
I normally never agree with Piers Morgan, but this case right here, I've got no choice but to. Yeah, I really find it funny how it is that we've just suddenly forgotten about history. We've suddenly forgotten about all the evils that have taken place, and we've suddenly forgotten about all the good that America and the West. It doesn't look that way today, but people oftentimes throw these opinions out there. They go mainstream. Next thing you know, they get famous for it, and then you find out, if you actually look into the person's background, you find out that they're a quack, and then you find out that basically their version of history is just good old-fashioned pseudo-history. Look, this right here comes from another place I'm not going to bring up because I'm not one of those guys who thinks that everything is bigotry or whatnot. You guys know me. I'm a lot more base than that, and I think that a lot of accusations that come from one particular group towards another, and I'm not going to say who it is, which YouTube's going to demonetize the video, probably demonetize the channel. What I'm simply saying is that if you actually look into both sides, I'm pretty sure you can find a happy medium and also at the same time find out the real truth. And so far, most of what Daryl Cooper's been saying just sounds absolutely crazy, absolutely nutty, and absolutely insane. But of course, there is probably another place where that comes from, which we'll get to here in a second. But I want to let this last part run a lot longer than normal, so that way we can go ahead and kind of get to the conclusion of what's going on, and I can go ahead and kind of preview video number 2, because obviously this same conversation would in fact come up between Dave Smith and Seth Dillon, two guys I really and truly don't
We'd
like.
won the Battle of Britain, of course, by that time. Would he preferred us not to have won the Battle of Britain? Of course we needed to stay in that war, because, apart from anything else, Churchill later on knew that Hitler was going to invade Russia, which was going to alter everything. But to criticise Churchill for trying to so-called drag America into the war, it was Hitler who actually declared war against America on the 11th of December 1941, 4 days after Pearl Harbor. Had nothing to do with Churchill at all.
I think part of it was probably kind of personal. You know, he wanted redemption. He wanted to go out there and like prove that he's the warlord that can go out there and fight this big war. I think part of it, I read about Churchill and he strikes me as a psychopath. But he's also a sort of, he was a drunk. He was very childish in strange ways.
I mean, Churchill's a psychopath. I mean, I think he doesn't actually know what a psychopath is.
Okay, there's a lot to go through there. Okay, Churchill being a drunk, I don't see how the hell that really hurts him that much, especially given the fact that here in the United States, for some odd reason, we glorify Ulysses S. Grant, even though every battle that he took place in ended up being more of a meat grinder for the North, ended up being more of a meat grinder for the Union than it did the Confederacy. The guy was not that competent. I'm sorry, he just wasn't. But still, at the same time, he was an absolute drunk. But yet, we don't go after him the same way somebody's going after Churchill. To go on top of that there, you've also got this comparison to David Irving, which I will get to kind of close the video out, because I think that right there is where a lot of this right here is coming from. But there's also something else, too, that does, in fact, need to be said. And that right there is to answer the first half of the segment. And that is that shortly after Pearl Harbor, Hitler decided to do what? Declare war on the United States. Now, let me say this real quick. If you are a commander at war, or the Fuhrer, and let's just say you've conquered pretty much all of Europe, and you're still fighting England, who you've been fighting for close to 2 years at this point in time, you're fighting the big Russian bear, who he stupidly defended. Or excuse me, he stupidly invaded. My bad, I apologize. You've got an ally over there in Japan, and you've not asked them to invade the Soviet Union from the east. You've not asked them to do so. By the way, Japan, on the other hand, is a separate topic altogether, because the hubris of these people was absolutely insane. And don't get me started on the war crimes that occurred there. Why in the world would you declare war on the United States of America, of all people, especially given their capability to produce the... let's just say the goods that they produced. By the way, it's one of the main reasons why it is that I believe the United States is the one who actually won the war, not the Russians. It's probably because Adolf Hitler was an outright first-rate loon. That right there is probably the real reason why. All you got to do is look at the man's medical history right there, right around 1941. He was starting to suffer from Parkinson's disease. He was becoming more and more paranoid. If you actually look at what the generals were saying about him, he basically was wanting yes men. He had removed Heinz Guderian, probably his best tank general. He removed him over disagreements. He would later on in the war have Erwin Rommel killed, because Erwin Rommel was suspected of an assassination attempt, never actually gave him an actual trial or anything like that. Hitler, at some point in time, just wanted yes men because of something that Andrew Roberts had said in his lecture on why it was that Adolf Hitler lost the war. It's because Adolf Hitler was too welded to his ideology. I hate to tell you this, but anybody who's too welded to their ideology is a first-rate loon. And that right there is what the hell it sounds like Mr. Cooper is. Now, I've done 2 videos now insulting this guy, and trust me, in the 3rd video, I'm going to insult the guy again, because guess what? He's a fucking fruitcake. That brings me to where this right came from. Look, somebody's going to come across this video and say, Zionist, Zionist, Zionist pig. Have I brought up Zionism? Have I brought up Israel? Have I brought up the... No, I haven't. I'm talking about basic common sense, basic common stuff. Now, the name David Irving was mentioned during this, and let me just go ahead and give you guys a brief explanation of David Irving. Now, you guys can read him all you want, but David Irving was a guy who went by the whole title of being a historian, and he basically came up with the assessment that Hitler didn't know what the hell was going on in the concentration camps. I'm not here to dispute that. I'm not here to say that he's correct. I'm not here to say that he's wrong. That is not what the hell I'm here to do. If you ask me, my personal opinion is that Adolf Hitler launched an invasion knowing what the hell he was going to do, and knowing that his ideology, believing very, very much in his ideology being superior, having a deep hatred for the Slavs, and having a deep hatred for the Jews, that, of course, he was probably going to eradicate anybody that possibly could be a POW, somebody not to feed. Cooper tried to make this point in the first video, and you guys probably, if I'd have played the actual volume of the clips I played in the B-roll footage, he was trying to say they weren't prepared. Well, here's the thing. If you know you're not prepared, or if you know that you're probably going to execute said POWs, then why in the world are you launching the invasion except to do harm on the civilian populace, not just their military? Look, Hitler did not want to fully destroy England, even though he obviously attacked it and bombed the hell out of it. He wanted England's army beaten so that way he could reestablish some form of commerce with them. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, he actually wanted Lebensraum. He actually wanted that living space, and therefore he was willing to kill civilians to get it. The fact of the matter is, anybody who's saying that this guy right here doesn't know what the hell is going on in the concentration camps, I think that right there is a bit naive. And the reason why I think it's naive is because more than likely you're getting reports and of course Hitler being the guy who preferred yes men over people who actually had brains, chances are he was probably shutting that down from the start. Now, some people could argue that Goring knew and Hitler didn't know, or Himmler knew and that Hitler didn't know, or Goebbels knew and Hitler didn't know. And my response to that would be, well, it sounds like you're all pretty damn evil. But of course, I also still maintain the position that Joseph Stalin was also an evil SOB as well. But you guys tell me what you think in the comment section. Please hit the like button, subscribe, share the video. This video right here will be out late in the afternoon. Also, to go on top of that there, I will be back tomorrow with the second half for part 2, the follow-up to this one right here. So make sure you guys stick around.